Hi there. So let's do a couple more chapters in 1900 or The Last President, written by Ingersoll Lockwood in 1896. It's getting interesting. If you missed the last one, go and listen to it because it sets the whole thing up. Jump over here and we'll begin with chapter 3. The pens of many writers would not suffice to describe with anything like historical fullness and precision the wild scenes of excitement which, on the morning after Election Day, burst forth on the floors of the various exchanges throughout the Union. The larger and more important the money center, the deeper, blacker, and heavier the despair which sank upon them after the violent outburst of protest, defiance, and execration had subsided. With some, it seemed that visions of their swift but sure impoverishment only served to transform the dark and dismal drama of revolution and disintegration into a side-splitting farce, and they greeted the prospective loss of their millions with loud guffaws and indescribable antics of horseplay and unseemly mirth. As the day wore on, the news became worse and worse. It was only too apparent that the House of Representatives of the 55th Congress would be controlled by the combined vote of the Populist and Free Silvermen. While the wild joy with which the entire South welcomed the election of Bryan and Sewall left little doubt in the minds of the Northern people, and the Southern senators would, to a man, arrange themselves on the administration side of the great conflict into which the Republic was soon to be precipitated. Add to these the 22 senators of the free silver states of the North, and the new president would have the Congress of the Republic at his back. There would be nothing to stand between him and the realization of those schemes which an exuberant fancy, untamed by the land of experience and scornful of the leading strings of wisdom, can conjure up. Did we say nothing? Nay, not so, for the Supreme Court was still there, and yet Justice Field had come fully up to the 80th milestone in the journey of life, and Justice Gray was nearly 70, while one or two other members of this high court of judicature held to their lives with feeble grasp. Even in due and orderly course of events, why might there not come vacancies, and then... In spite of the nameless dread that rested upon so many of our people, and chilled the very blood of the country's industries, the new year, 1897, came hopefully, serenely, almost defiantly in. There was an indescribable something in the air, a spirit of political devil-may-care, a feeling that the old order had passed away, and that the Republic had entered the womb of time and been born again. The sentiment began to give outward and visible signs of its existence and growth in the remote agricultural districts of the South and far West. They threw aside their working implements, loitered about, gathered in groups, and the words Washington, White House, Silver, Bryan offices, 2 for 1, and the South's Day, reign of the common people, taxes, incomes, year of jubilee, free coinage, Wall Street, Altgeld, Tillman, Pfeffer, Coxey, were whispered in a mysterious way with head noddings and pursing up of mouths. As January wore away and February, slipping by, brought Bryan's inauguration nearer and nearer. The groups melted into groups, and it was only too apparent that from a dozen different points in the South and Northwest Coxey armies were forming for an advance on Washington. In some instances they were well clad and well provisioned. In others they were little better than great bands of hungry and restless men, demoralized by idleness and wrought up to a strange degree of mental excitement by the extravagant harangues of their leaders, who were animated but with one thought, namely, to make use of these vast crowds of silver pilgrims, as they called themselves, to back up their claims for public office. These crowds of deluded people were well named silver pilgrims, for hundreds of them carried in hempen bags pieces of silver in 99 cases of 100 plated stuff of little value, which unscrupulous dealers and peddlers had palmed off on them as sterling, with the promises that once in Washington the United States would coin their metal into Bryan dollars, giving 2 for 1 in payment for it. Yeah, right. While these motley armies marched upon the capital of the Republic, the railway trains Night and day brought vast crowds of new men, politicians of low degree, men out of employment, drunken and disgruntled mechanics, farmers' sons, to seek their fortunes under the reign of the people, healers and hangers-on of ward bosses, old men who had not tasted office for 30 years and more, all inspired by Mr. Bryan's declaration that the American people are not in favor of life tenure in the civil service, that a permanent office-holding class is not in harmony with our institutions, that a fixed term of appointed offices would open the public service to a larger number of citizens without impairing its efficiency, all bearing new brooms in their hands or across their shoulders, each and every one of them supremely confident that in the distribution of the spoils something would surely fall to his share, since they were the common people, who were so dear to Mr. Bryan, and who had made him president in the very face of the prodigious opposition of the rich men, whose coffers had been thrown wide open, all to no purpose, and in spite, too, of the satanic and truly devilish power that hell upon earth, known as Wall Street, which had sweated gold in vain in its desperate efforts to fasten the chains of trust and the claws of soulless monsters known as corporations upon these very common people, soon to march in triumph before the silver chariot of the young conqueror from the west. Chapter 4. There had been a strange prophecy put forth by someone, and it made its way into the daily journals, and had been laughingly or seriously commented upon, according to the political tone of the paper, or the passing humor of the writer, that March 4th of 1897 would never dawn upon the American people. There was something very curious and uncanny about the prediction, and what actually happened was not qualified to loosen the fearful tension of public anxiety, for the day literally and truly never dawned upon the city of Washington, and well deserves its historical name, the Dawnless Day. At 6 o'clock, the hour of daybreak, such an impenetrable pall of clouds overhung the city that there came no signs of day. The gathering crowds could plainly hear the plaintive cries and lamentations put up in the Negro quarters of the city. Remember, this is 1896. Not until nearly 9 o'clock did the light cease to shine in darkness, and the darkness began to comprehend it. But although it was a cheerless gray day, even at high noon, its heaviness set no weight upon the spirits of the jubilant tens of thousands which completely filled the city and its public parks, and ran over into camps and hastily improvised shelters outside the city limits. Not until the day previous had the president announced the names of those selected for his cabinet. The South and Far West were fairly beside themselves with joy, for there had been, from their standpoint, ugly rumors abroad for several days. It had even been hinted that Bryan had surrendered to the money changers, and that the selection of his constitutional advisers would prove him recreant to the glorious cause of popular government, and that the reign of common people would remain but a dream of the struggling masses. But these apprehensions were short-lived. The young president stood firm and fast on the platform of the parties which had raised him to his proud eminence. And what better proof of his thorough belief in himself and in his mission could he have given than the following? Secretary of State William M. Stewart of Nevada. Secretary of the Treasury Richard P. Bland of Missouri. Secretary of War John P. Altgeld of Illinois. Attorney General Roger Q. Mills of Texas. Postmaster General Henry George of New York. Secretary of Navy John Gray Evans of South Carolina. Secretary of Interior William A. Pfeffer of Kansas. Secretary of Agriculture Leif Pence of Colorado. The first thing that had flashed across the minds of many upon glancing over this list of names was the omission therefrom of Tillman's. What did it mean? Could the young president have quarreled with his best friend, his most powerful coadjutor? But the wiser ones only shook their heads and may answer that it was Tillman's hand that filled the blank for Secretary of the Navy, left there by the new ruler after the people's own heart. Evans was but a creation of this great commoner of the South, an image graven with his hands. The inaugural address was not a disappointment. To those who had come to hear it, it was like the man who delivered it, bold, outspoken, unmistakable in its terms, promising much, impatient of precedent, reckless of result, and double confirmation that this was to be the reign of the common people, that much should be unmade and much made over, and no matter how rich the man might cry out in anger or amazement, the nation must march on to the fulfillment of a higher and nobler mission than the impoverishment and degradation of the millions for the enrichment and elevation of the few. Scarcely had the young president, his large eyes filled with a strange light, and his smooth, hairless visage radiant as a cloudless sky, his wife's arm twined around his, and their hands linked in those of their children, passed within the lofty portal of the White House. Then he threw himself into a chair, and seizing a sheet of official paper, penned the following order, and directed its immediate promulgation. Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C., March 4th, 1897. Executive Order Number 1. In order that there may be immediate relief in the terrible financial depression now weighing upon our beloved country, consequent upon the resulting from the unlawful combination of capitalists and moneylenders both in this republic and in England, and that the ruinous and inevitable progress toward our universal gold standard may be stayed, the President orders and directs an immediate abandonment of the so-called gold reserve, and that on and after the promulgation of this order, the gold and silver standard of the Constitution to be resumed and strictly maintained in all the business transactions of the government. It was 2:00 in the afternoon when the news of this now world-famous executive order was flashed into the great banking centers of the country. Its effect in Wall Street beggars description. On the floor of the stock exchange, men yelled and shrieked like painted savages, and in their mad struggles tore and trampled each other. Many dropped in fainting fits, or fell exhausted from their wild and senseless efforts to say what none would listen to. Ashen pallor crept over the faces of some, while the blood threatened to burst the swollen arteries that spread in purple network over the brows of others. When silence came at last, it was a silence broken by sobs and groans. Some wept, while others stood dumbstruck as if it was all a bad dream, and they were waiting the return of their poor distraught senses to set them right again. Ambulances were hastily summoned, and fainting and exhausted forms were borne through hushed and whispering masses, wedged into Wall Street, to be whirled away uptown to their residences, there to come into full possession of their senses, only to cry out in their anguish that ruin, black ruin, stared upon them in the face of this news from Washington should prove true. If the face. We're at 12. So let's stop there. That's 2 chapters. We will continue this tomorrow. Keep up. Go back and listen if you missed any. It's getting interesting. Some of this you got to read slow because there's a lot of hidden meanings and stuff in this, so even I missed some of it, but I'll go over it again and maybe have some explanation next time. And until then, keep reading. See ya.